Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to our midwinter weather outlook webinar. My name is Andrea Berg, and I am your host for today. A couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to go over. We are recording this webinar, and so if you miss anything or you want to share with anyone in your organization, or you want to go back and re-listen, we will be sending out a link to the recording probably early next week. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free in reaching out to me through the Q&A or the chat feature, and we will try our best to help you through those difficulties. We have reserved time at the end for any questions you may have, but please don't wait to the end to submit your questions. Use the Q&A or the chat feature within the Zoom, and we will look at your questions and answer them as we can. So with that, I am going to turn this presentation over to Nathan. Nathan, you have control.
All right. Thank you, Andrea. My name is Nate Hamblin. I'm a weather risk communicator for our long range team here at DTN, and presenting with me, Stephen Strum. And we have a lot of information to go through, so let's get to it. Let's go through an agenda real quick. First, we'll go through climate review and trends. So we'll get a quick overview of what has happened so far this winter season, and then we'll go into our forecast techniques, which is our ENSO analog and ENSO outlook and analog patterns, which is our statistical method based on previous years. And then we'll talk about the polar vortex, and we'll see what the model guidance is doing, and then we'll wrap everything up into a seasonal forecast, which will go forward through April, along with our updated heating degree day outlook. After that, we'll go over how this will impact different industries such as utilities, aviation, transportation, and offshore. All right, we can do it. All right, winter 2025-26 review. Highlights so far. Well, we've been experiencing a weak La Nina, which and so far, looking here at the jet stream winds aloft, but where the oranges and yellows and greens are stronger than normal jet stream winds, and the blues are weaker than normal. And a typical La Nina northern U.S. jet stream look so far. So for the storm track and everything has mostly been so far this winter. December was pretty persistently cold across the Great Lakes and Northeast as a result. It's a major warm anomaly set up shop across the West, some of which were the warmest on record. The Midwest through parts of the Mid-Atlantic and parts of even northern New England have seen kind of a fast start to the snow season. And lake effect snow has been pretty busy so far this winter season. Let's talk a little bit about December. And it's been a tale of two different parts of the country. On the left-hand side, the West, with temperatures. These are rankings for each state over the past 131 years. And for most of the West, it has been the warmest on record overall, with the exception of Idaho and Montana, which were pretty close behind. And then Nebraska through Texas, also very warm. But if you look at the northeastern part of the country, it has not been a lot lower numbers. So ranks in the 30s. So not the coldest on record, but below average overall. And on the right-hand side, you have precipitation, and it's been close to the wettest on record across parts of the Northwest so far. See rankings in the upper 120s in some spots. But on the other hand, it's been as dry as it could be just about across the south central part of the country and into the south parts of the southeast. So everything has been pretty persistent thus far. Polar vortex this winter season so far, it's been disrupted. It's been weaker than average. So if you follow the graph on the left, the trace, the blue line showing what the observed 10 millibars, 60-degree north zonal winds are. So the higher these are, the stronger the polar vortex is. The lower these are, the weaker. And I'll point out there's been a few different disturbances that have occurred and weakened the polar vortex, some of which occurred very early in the season, a very strong one, almost as strong as one we've seen in late November, and then had another one in mid-December, and then it strengthened a bit into early January. But by the time we got to about where we are now, had another one take place. But it really hasn't busted it up, the vortex per se, and it usually doesn't during the early season. But what it has done is it stretched it out and displaced it. So looking at here at the right-hand side, you can see the blue little circle over eastern Canada near Hudson Bay. And so it's overall in the means between early December and about now, the polar vortex is stretched out between Europe and there, and it is a bit weaker. If you look at the higher, or the warmer colors, the red, the yellows and blues, that's we're kind of had a high pressure system set up over parts of the Aleutian through Alaska and Siberia. So it's been that's been the feature that's been displacing the polar vortex a little bit further along. So let's take a quick look at some recent trends here. And November, December, and January do have one thing in common. In the northeastern part of the country, it has been colder than average. November wasn't markedly so, but December and January kind of turned out to be that way. Now, when we talk about January, we're talking about what has happened up until yesterday and what is coming. So and it's been a bit different. So you might think to yourself, hey, it hasn't been all that cold in January just yet. And you're right, it hasn't. The second week of January warmed up significantly across the country. But what's coming up here over the next 10 days is going to reverse that. We're going to end up below average. On the other hand, in the West, no winter to be found. November, December, January, all well above average. So exceptional warmth overall in that region. And so if you take a look at the 3-month average, counting what's coming, well above average in the West, especially the interior West, where fall this is persisting. And in the North, in the Great Lakes, Northeast, and Mid-Atlantic, it's been more or less below average for the most part. And then everywhere in between, a lot of volatility from the southeast through the northern plains. Taking a look at heating degree days, and this is the departure from normal. And central and western U.S., well below average number of HDDs. But if you look at the East, it's been a little bit closer to normal. Now, this is counting the entire season, not just November, December, and January. So it starts a little bit earlier in the season, and October was pretty warm for the most part. So it's gotten off to a slow start up to that point, but some spots are right near average. And spoiler alert, this is about to change here across a good chunk of the East, especially the Northeast where HDD numbers are going to start piling up. If we were to look at this map 10 days later, you're going to start seeing some blues show up across parts of the east. And precipitation trends, a lot of dryness out there. Look at the November through December, or excuse me, November through January map on the right-hand side, especially in the southeastern quadrant of the country. Not a lot of precipitation thus far. The southwest, on the other hand, has been pretty busy. So, and then the north will be a little bit up, a lot of ups and downs, and a little bit drier in the northeast. And so if you look at each month, November, December, and January, especially November, December, has been pretty busy in the west. January, we're quieting things down a bit there. But if you look at the southeastern part of the country, it's been persistent all the way through the period. December, there was a pretty busy storm track across the northern tier, which cut into that, although most of those systems were weak. And then January, if we add up what's coming versus what has happened, even with this system coming up, the forecast is still for a pretty dry southeastern part of the country. Although above average precipitation from parts of the Four Corners region up to the upper Midwest. The Great Lakes ice coverage. We always like to look at this time of year to see how things are going. And we have about 22.8% ice cover. That has advanced rapidly in recent days. Now, Lake Erie has taken the bulk of the ice. Not a whole lot of open water left on it. Maybe the eastern third where it's a little bit deeper overall. Closer to Buffalo, there's maybe a little bit more open water, but that is closing up quick. most of the other lakes are pretty wide open, other than the shallow bays and whatnot. Lake Ontario is certainly pretty wide open, but if you look at the ice coverage for all five lakes, a lot of ups and downs. It was above average in early January after some late December cold. But the big warm up we just talked about actually dropped some of that back. But in recent days, we've made a rapid advance and we're back to about average. So we are 22.8%, but that is about to rise. And I think we're going to go notably above average here after the next couple of weeks because of the amount of cold that is coming. Seasonal snowfall so far. On the left, you see the actual snowfall totals. And it looks a lot like what you'll see in most seasons. The Midwest, Northeast lead the way, but a few things stand out on this map. Number one, notice that little tongue that's coming down from South Carolina through South Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. So they got it again this year. Another snow event, although not nearly as significant as last year's. And of course, the lake effect snow stands out. Looking on the right, these are anomalies. Now, it doesn't capture everything. This is kind of smoothed out, so it doesn't show you the entire impact, but it gives you a good idea. The Midwest through parts of upstate New York and into northern New England have seen above average snowfall, as has Virginia. They've been hit with a couple weaker systems and have gotten off to a quick start. Of course, any snow that falls in South Georgia and Florida is above average. But looking at the West, it's been kind of a slow start with all those warm temperatures. It's not too much of a surprise, but above up the northern plains and then into the Pacific Northwest, a few spots there are above average. Now, California might look meager to you, but it's not analyzed super well. But what's not shown here is that there's a pretty large event here that put a big dent in that. So even though it looks like it's below average, I think especially the Sierra southward into Southern California, I think we're off to a pretty fast start down there. Some highlights from each month coming up. November started off pretty busy. Right towards the end of the month, there's a decent snowstorm across the Midwest from Iowa, Northeast Missouri through northern Illinois, including Chicago. And Chicago saw 8.7 inches of snowfall from that. So, and a lot of places saw even a little bit more, up to a foot in some spots. So that's pretty good for that early season event. But other things happened too. Early in the month, major Pacific storm brought heavy rain and mountain snow to the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. And there was some pretty significant flooding that occurred in a few spots. There was a decent, what we call an atmospheric river event very early in the season. And then we had an early snow event that impacted the Midwest to the Southern Appalachians. Lumberton, North Carolina, for example, saw its earliest snow on record. And then record lows actually fell across portions of the Deep South. So we did have a pretty cold mid-November period across the South. And then moving forward, we had a heavy rainfall impacted parts of the desert Southwest due to a slow-moving system. Matter of fact, we even had a tornado and some hail reports observed from a severe storm just west of the Phoenix, Arizona metro area. So pretty impressive. And while that was going on, we had record heat across parts of the southern plains. Dallas and Waco saw record highs of almost 90 degrees. So that's pretty impressive. December, severe weather was on the menu here. We had a decent event across parts of the Midwest late in the month. There's the 28th. But earlier in the month, we had another atmospheric river event that caused some massive flooding across parts of the Pacific Northwest. So they got hit again. More than 20 inches of rain and fell across portions of the Washington Cascades below the snow line, and it pushed the Snoqualmie River up to almost 18 feet, which is the highest it's been in over a decade. So very impressive event in its own right there. While all that was going on, we had some freezing fog on bridge and elevated roadways, which led to very many vehicle crashes and road closures. This happened in parts of South Carolina, so that was pretty impressive. And then we talked about the severe weather, and then had a big lake effect snow event that occurred across the Great Lakes later in the month. Parts the areas that are used to getting it got it, but Syracuse, New York saw 24.1 inches in 24 hours during that period, which is as heavy as 24-hour snowfall total since the blizzard of 93. So just to show you how impressive that was. And then, of course, December was one of the warmest Decembers on record for most of the West through the southern plains. And then January, the lake effect snow sort of persisted. So, 2 to 3 feet of snow occurred across some localized areas. Now, most of that was the eastern Great Lakes, and most of that was north of Syracuse. So, Syracuse didn't get much more, but areas north of Syracuse and areas south of Buffalo were able to cash in on some snow there. And then we had a decent snow event across portions of the southern Rockies and the western Kansas on the 9th of January. And then looking at how warm it was across most of the country. This is a 7-day temperature anomaly forecast with all that red on the map. And that was just insanely warm. So it got very, very warm and very humid for a few spots with a lot of record highs fell across parts of the central U.S. into the southeast for that matter. And then the aforementioned event that gave snow for parts of South Carolina through the Florida Panhandle. That occurred on the 17th into the 18th. At the same time that occurred, we had some accumulating snow across portions of the Northeast U.S. urban corridor, so getting them in on the action. And in this January highlight slide, it would look a heck of a lot different if we were to do this 10 days later, because we do have this big storm system coming up that Steve will talk about. January global temperatures, it's very cold in a lot of places. Alaska, the eastern U.S., then parts of Northern Europe, Northeastern Europe, and the Scandinavia, and then a lot of Russia will be well below average. So a lot more cold around this year than in recent years from a global standpoint. Severe weather so far this winter. We talked about the Midwest during that later part of December. That occurred, and then a little bit in January through central Oklahoma, then another event through the deep south. A little bit up in the western New York overall during that warm period. So that was pretty impressive for this time of year. So let's get into the seasonal forecast now. And our winter seasonal influencers, ENSO is a big one. Depending upon how strong it is, it can overwhelm the pattern, or if it's weaker, it can let other things take over, like the polar vortex and the subseasonal influences. So most of the time we say 40% is ENSO, but it varies. Polar vortex, if there's a disturbance, it can take over. Subseasonal stuff like the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation, that can alter the pattern during shorter time periods and leave a stamp on the winter season. And of course, we can look out the window and see what kind of trends have been occurring and build that stuff into the forecast. But we have the best skill of forecasting ENSO and the associated impacts, but the polar vortex and especially the subseasonal categories are a lot tougher to do on a seasonal time scale. That's more of a subseasonal where we'll be able to narrow it down within a week or two of the event sometimes. But doing it from a seasonal standpoint is much more difficult. So that's why we say there's low skill in that. All right, our main seasonal drivers. We have a weak La Nina in place right now, and that's forecast to steadily weaken to ENSO neutral by late winter. And you can see here on the ECMWF forecast for water temperature anomalies from February through April, all that blue that used to be there is basically gone. It's going to melt away, not all that warmth building in the eastern Pacific, west of South America. So that's where warmth will show up first. Negative phase of the Pacific decadal oscillation, which is basically what that means, is that you have warm water in the North Pacific with relatively cooler water along the west coast. And the warmer AMO, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, that just means there's warmer North Atlantic water temperature. So we have to look through the record and find years that have similar ocean temperature profiles as what we're forecast to experience this year. And this can give us some clues as to what kind of weather might be coming. And let's focus on ENSO for just a moment. Excuse me. Um, what you see here are ENSO forecasts from modeling centers all across the world. There are a lot of different ones out there. And the thick red line is the model average. And so note here we are in the La Nina camp, but that is going to change. We're going to go advancing upward through the neutral category through the rest, through late winter and into the spring. And there's a pretty decent chance we'll have an El Nino in place during the summertime. So things are about to change, but La Nina has controlled the pattern for now. But it won't have it for long because of a couple things that are going on right now. If we look at some equatorial upper ocean heat anomalies, the graph in the center with all those lines on it, you'll note here there we've analyzed a downwelling Kelvin wave. And what those things like to do is take warmer water that's in the Western Pacific and drive them eastward at depth. So what you see is some of the warmer water at the surface is brought downward, and you have warm anomalies down in the subsurface area. That's usually the types of things that eventually lead to warming. And on top of that, we have a lot of what you see there on the left is the ECMWF forecast for zonal wind anomalies. So you see all those oranges, that's westerly wind anomalies. And this is going to be that's the wind aloft, so that's going to be the kind of thing that can drive some of the surface warm water further east. And our first big one is occurring right now and will drift eastward over the next couple of weeks. So what that will do is we'll start the process of weakening our La Nina setup. So this is the kind of thing that we saw in 2023 in January. Before we got into the El Nino there. So it gives us some confidence that that's what's going to happen eventually. So let's take a look at some analogs. NRC surface temperature analogs, we show all the same types of things that the forecast showed. Note the warmer look in the North Pacific, but cooler along the West Coast. And then this warmer patch in the Western Pacific, and that can change the pattern by itself. And then the warmer North Atlantic water temperatures, and you can see the warmth trying to build in the equatorial Pacific, just west of South America. So we have all the main features covered with our analogs. And the jet stream is forecast to be quite strong across the central and northern US, weaker in the Gulf and across Mexico. So that's what the analogs say, though. There's going to be some times where that changes, though. So that's going to be happening over the next 10 days where that jet stream is going to be able to dip pretty far south. But for the most part, we think it'll stay you'll see it more often to the north than to the south. So analog trends and daily temperature. So what you see here, you took our analogs together, did a weighted average, and this is a 7-day average centered on the date. And then the warm and cold risk you see in the red and the blue represent one standard deviation, warmer or cooler. So the idea here is when the analogs, when all these lines are closer together, the analog signal is the more the analogs are saying the same thing, so it's a stronger signal. When they're not, when they're further apart, that's a weaker signal. So what you see here, you see a cooler start to early February. It tries to warm up maybe a little bit in middle February, and another cool patch coming probably in the middle towards the end of February. And then temperatures want to warm up in the early March, very, very end of February into early March. And then maybe another dip during the middle part of March. So what you're seeing here is a lot of volatility. And then for everything, and that kind of continues through the end of March and into April. You see lots of ups and downs coming. And we've had a lot of that so far this winter. So what we're anticipating is just more of the same when it comes to that general idea. And took the top 6 analogs and showed you what kind of things are, what happened during those snow years. You can see there's a lot of variability as there is every year, but there are some themes. Number one here, you can see a few of them that allowed some snow to dip into the south. Last year, of course, was one, 08, 09 did it, and then 2013, 2014, 96, 97, all those had some snow get into the south to some way. So there's a signal for that, and we're going to definitely account for that, especially considering what's about to happen. And then other themes, pretty busy in the northwestern part of the country. Most of these type of years have that going on. And then a lot of variability in the Midwest and Northeast, and that depends on a lot of the storm track here. So I would anticipate that 2016, 2017 would not be the a great snow analog, but some sort of combination of 24, 25, 08, 09, and 2013, 2014. All those together, I think, will be pretty close if you were to average that to what might be the final result. Let's talk about the polar vortex real quick. Strong polar vortex is more circular, which keeps the coldest air at higher latitudes. Strong winds, we talked about 60 millibar or 60 degrees north, 10 millibars. That's a strong jet, but when it weakens, that jet tends to become more wavy, and that's when cold air can come down. And again, prediction time on this can be limited to under 2 weeks. And the ECMWF forecast of those zonal winds right now they're pretty strong. You can see the blues up near 40 right off the bat. We'll get a weaker disturbance coming up in a few days. It'll strengthen again towards the end of the month, but towards the earliest or especially middle February, there's a forecast for the winds to weaken a bit. And there's a potential for a polar vortex disturbance. Now, if we get those winds down to zero, that could be a major disturbance, and that could alter things and at the very least introduce even more blocking into the patterns. This is something we're going to watch because a lot of times the impacts aren't felt immediate, but somewhere down the line, that could bring a little bit of a cold shot. Notice the analogs had something in mid-March. Here's this in February. This could be the thing that leads to it. The model signals do show some weakening overall. The ECMWF wants to strengthen it back up. The JMA, on the other hand, wants to bring it down in early February. It does look like the better model to look at right now. It's a little bit too early to know the exact specifics of how all this will be an impact, but uh, I do think the idea of a weaker polar vortex later in the season is pretty good, even though, again, ups and downs with it. The MJO forecast in early February. We're forecast to go through phase 8 and into phase 1 during the very, very end of this month into very early February. And analogs from that suggest that warmth will be able to build across the central U.S. and in the west, will still remain cold in the east. And our forecast for that will represent that. So all this Arctic air that we're forecasting, this extreme cold, is going to move off, and we're going to get more Pacific-based flow, but we're still going to have some cooler air that occurs in the east, especially east of the Appalachians. And then it looks like a dry forecast. The phase A analogs up there on the right. Notice here, not much there except for Texas. And the forecast look exactly like that. So it should settle things down, other than maybe some lake effect snow in early February and get a little break from this weather. But it does look like we're going to have some upward motion. Remember, we showed you that warm patch in the tropical Western Pacific. We get upward motion over that. That's going to kick off some organized thunderstorm activity. And when that happens, it sets off a chain of events that eventually ends up with that Alaska Ridge, that minus EPO, minus Eastern Pacific Oscillation, that Alaska Ridge, the thing that likes to bring Arctic air into North America. That's going to build during the middle part of February once again, and that could unleash yet another Arctic air mass into the into the central and eastern U.S. sometime during the second half of February. Maybe the 15th to the 25th could be a good time for that, and that's something we're going to have to watch. Now, not everything's going to be a repeat. This is an extreme version of that, but we're going to have to keep a close eye out for that, and that could impact things. So, a quick look at analogs versus guidance. For February, the analogs probably aren't it. It does show more cold in the north and west, but the ECMWF shows colder air into the east and Midwest, and the CFS kind of hints at it. So analogs probably are going to fail in February here, I think. But the on the model guidance, though, not too bad. On the analogs, it does show more of a traditional La Nina impact for the above average precipitation, Great Lakes in the Northwest. ECMWF and the CFS has more precipitation further south and less further north, and that's probably better. And the Southwest will be a little drier. We get into March, the analogs have a cooler northern U.S. and Canada, and then warmer in the south. The ECMWF is quite warm and probably incorrect. The CFS, however, keeps its current pattern going, and it kind of shows you that cold risk that could occur. So something to watch there. The analog precipitation is above average in the northern U.S. and then sneaking that way into the Tennessee Valley. The ECMWF and CFS a lot wetter overall across parts of the Arcotex region through the Ohio Valley, and then also joins the analogs of being wetter from the Great Lakes to the northwest. And then April, analogs are cool in the central U.S., warmer along the eastern seaboard. The ECMWF just shows a lot of warmth. That's probably not going to happen. The CFS does show a cooler look from the upper Midwest through the central U.S., more or less a continuation of the pattern. And then a busy pattern mostly in the east from the analogs and then through the Arcotex region. Now, that could be a severe weather potential across the south. We'll have to watch for that. So the analogs show warmer overall across the east and south, cooler in the north central and northwest. And then the analogs all show above average precipitation in the Ohio Valley and through the northwest, below average in the southeast and the southwest. And I'm going to let Steve here take it and wrap this up to a forecast for us. Take it away, Steve.
All right. Thank you, Nate. Let's see if I can start controlling here. Oops. All right, so we looked at all the climatology, the 10-year trends, the analog composites. Now we'll kind of put all of that together into our final forecast for the upcoming months. So first off, though, a big influence on how things average out here for the balance of the winter season is going to be what happens here in the next 2 weeks. And we have a lot of Arctic air spilling southward late this week through next week. Widespread well below normal temperatures, quite likely for the central and the eastern U.S. And a big combination impact with that is going to be a major winter storm that will be developing this weekend across the south central U.S. and heading towards the East Coast. And that's going to produce a swath of very heavy snowfall from somewhere in Texas and Oklahoma eastward towards the middle Atlantic. And with the widespread snow cover likely, as well as likely a significant ice storm for parts of Texas and the southeast, we're going to have just a large portion of the country covered in snow and ice as we head into next week. And that is going to have a big influence on temperatures. All that snow and ice cover will help to reflect a lot of sunlight and just help to maintain a colder pattern than would otherwise be the case. So many areas are going to really struggle to warm much next week with the widespread snow cover. Even if you get a south wind, when you have hundreds of miles of snow cover between the Gulf Coast and say Chicago or Cincinnati, that warm south wind becomes fairly cold by the time it gets up there. So it's going to be really a struggle to warm even when we have a warmer flow pattern. And then on top of that, we're going to see additional rounds of colder air sliding southward here through the end of the month across the eastern U.S. So strong cold anomalies again, kind of skewing the whole January average colder. And a very impactful winter storm on tap here from Texas up through Kansas eastward to the East Coast. So, many of the big metropolitan areas from Dallas northward and then, from Atlanta to Charlotte to New York City are all going to see a lot of impactful winter weather coming up here over the next few days from this Friday into Sunday. And so certainly potentially the biggest winter weather events of the season coming up with a combination of the extreme cold and the widespread heavy snow and ice cover. See where our controls went. There we go. So if we look at the forecast here for the balance of the winter season, there's going to be some ups and downs here. So we're going to see a lot of big swings either direction. On average, though, likely averaging near to below average for the northern and the eastern U.S. and above average for the south central and the southwestern U.S. February is likely going to start warm across the central and the western U.S., but lingering cold will probably continue for the eastern U.S. And then again, that potential exists, as Nate talked about, for possibly another round of colder weather that's more widespread across the central and eastern U.S., middle, late month somewhere in there. And then additional rounds possible during March as well. So even though the Plains region is shown to be above average for February and the southern half of the central and eastern U.S. above average during March, we're still likely going to see some rounds of colder weather in those areas during those 2 months. So it's not going to be turning persistently warm once we get out of this current cold wave. We're likely going to see just a period of warmth and then the cold comes back, but then kind of a back and forth pattern with a lot of big swings, both warm and cold for those areas of the country. So can advance here, which is a struggle apparently. Um, Looking here at the HDDs and CDDs, you can see we're actually going to be pretty close to average for HDDs for the remainder of the winter season, and actually for the winter season as a whole. December was pretty close to average, with a colder eastern U.S. and warmer western U.S., and that likely looks to be the case for a lot of the remainder of the winter season in terms of HDD totals. So we may actually average near slightly above average in terms of heating degree days this winter for the first time in several years. So if we look at our risks, though, there's actually a stronger probability of a colder forecast or a colder outcome than forecast than a warmer outcome than forecast for a lot of the northern half of the country. So that is something to keep in mind. Again, potentially additional rounds of cold coming in during the middle and end of February, as well as during March. And so if we do see another polar vortex disruption that produces a strong round of Arctic air like we're seeing currently at some point during February or March, that would be enough to skew the entire forecast average colder than what's currently expected. But again, we're going to see some milder interludes as well that are going to really kind of make it a little bit volatile and a little bit hard to come up with a clear-cut average for a lot of areas, with those big swings kind of canceling out in a lot of areas potentially over the next 3 months as a whole. But definitely some periods of impactful cold still likely to be the case during the remainder of the winter season. Now, looking at the gas-weighted HDDs in a little more detail, the thing of note here on the top is that that bar on the right there is the forecast for this winter season. And you can see this is actually going to be the first time since the winter of 2018-19 that we may actually end up with a near or colder than average winter season in terms of heating degree days. Again, part of that is helped by the fact that the cold in December was focused across the Midwest and Northeast and those higher population areas. And so even though we had record warmth across a lot of the country, those were in the lower population areas of the Rockies and Plains in many areas. And so the colder Northeast did help to skew things a little bit colder. And so definitely colder than the last several winters, as you can see. Even winters like 2020, 2021, where we had the incredibly cold February, had, for the most part, a mild winter season outside of that period of extreme cold. And so even that winter was warmer than average for the winter season as a whole, despite the record cold February. But certainly this year, we've had enough cold every month, and likely that should be the case going forward as well, for the winter to actually average pretty close to normal, or even a little bit colder than average from a heating degree day basis for the entire November to March period for the first time in several years. So going forward here to the next slide. There we go. Let me skip to. You can see for the precipitation side of things, certainly it's going to be kind of a mixed bag going forward here. Obviously, we have this major storm now that's going to produce a lot of heavy precipitation from the south central U.S. up to the mid-Atlantic. But we likely will see a period of dry weather return after that. And then, we're going to see some active periods in March across the northern U.S. from the northwest to the Great Lakes. So some of those storms up there could produce some significant snowfall in those areas. We may see the southern U.S. get more active as we head into the spring, possibly a big uptick in severe weather at that time as well across parts of the southern U.S. But definitely potentially a very active northern stream for a while as we head into the early part of the spring season and some big early March snowstorms for those areas. Now, on the probability side here, you can see there's actually a higher probability across parts of the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley and Tennessee Valley, that we could end up with a wetter forecast based on our analogs and all the other data kind of put together. So even though we do show our current forecast to be drier than average across parts of the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic, a lot of that is skewed by the fact that that's what we're seeing here coming up in the upcoming weeks for the first part of February, kind of helping to pull that average down a little bit. There is some risk that we could actually end up active enough later in this period to end up with a wetter forecast or wetter outcome than what's currently forecast in those areas. Now, snowfall is tricky here across the south. We're going to see a major impactful winter storm that's going to skew a lot of the southern half of the country snowier than the average for the winter season. One snowstorm in those areas makes the winter above normal in many cases. And so depending on exactly where that band of snow sets up here in the coming days, we'll end up probably with some heavier snowfall totals or heavier anomalies than what's kind of indicated there across parts of the south. But again, the northern tier likely staying active as we head into the early part of the spring season. We could see a lot of heavy snowfall in the early part of spring across the Dakotas, eastward towards the upper Midwest, and likely the Northwest as well, seeing an uptick in winter storms as we head through the balance of the winter season. Now, looking at drought conditions, you can see a lot of the Southwest up to the northern plains have drought in place right now, as well as parts of the East Coast. The current storm system coming up here will help alleviate some of that in the Tennessee Valley and parts of the Mid-Atlantic, but overall, we are looking, though, to see some expansion of drought across the Southwest and possibly the Deep South, Florida, and the Gulf Coast areas here as we head through the remainder of the winter season. Now, looking at the water supply across the western U.S., we're actually running at near record low snowpack across Colorado and parts of the Colorado Basin as a whole. And so that area in there is in desperate need of some higher snowfall totals. Again, our forecast, though, shows more of the snow farther north, so we'll see how much of that we can get into Colorado going forward here. California, though, has done pretty well. We've had some big storms across the Sierra that have really helped to, get most of the reservoir levels at or above normal there. So we'll see how that progresses for the remainder of the winter season. Things may not be as wet as they have been so far, with more of the rain and snow farther north into the northwest. But at the moment, things are doing pretty okay for California. Now, looking at the wildfire risks heading into the springs is always a big concern across a lot of the southern U.S., where we have a lot of dormant vegetation, and we get that period typically coming up, as we head into early spring, we get a lot of warm days, a lot of strong winds, especially across the plains, and everything is still dormant and burns very easily. And with dryness currently in place across Texas and some of the surrounding areas, there is a heightened risk for wildfires this spring as we head through late February into March across the south central U.S. And again, with the dryness across parts of the southeast, those areas as well could see a heightened wildfire risk, at least until everything greens up later this spring. Now, river flood risks, for the most part, things have been drier than average the last month or so across a lot of the southern U.S., but we do have a major storm system coming in now, the threat for additional storms in those areas as we head through the early part of the spring season. And we could see a wet April as well, potentially coming up. So we are going to have to watch out to see how the current snow and ice melts. If we get another storm on top of that with a heavy rainfall, with a rapid melting, we'll have to watch those areas there for some river flood conditions if things kind of play out in just the wrong way. But for the most part, at the moment, we don't have any major flood risks shaping up for the northern U.S. But again, those areas have the potential to see a lot of major winter storms in the early part of the spring season into April. And if we do, see a lot of snow cover build up in those areas, and then see some heavy rainfall, middle of the spring as that snow melts, the potential always exists for some major flooding in the spring season across the upper Midwest. So we'll have to watch that very closely. So kind of summarizing the forecast here across the northwestern U.S., we are going to be, again, seeing an increase in winter storms, more rain, more snow across those areas, and for the most part, averaging close to normal. The north central U.S. really has the potential to have a very active end of the winter season in the early part of spring. An uptick in winter storms in general, a lot of volatility, some additional rounds of severe Arctic cold, quite possible during parts of middle and late February, possibly again during March. A lot of volatility there. And so definitely, more winter to come for sure across the north central U.S. The northeastern U.S., again, also may see more cold than not. We may not see any big coastal storms. We'll have to watch to see if we do get one more of those storms kind of we have coming up this weekend. That kind of tracks from the south central U.S. towards the east coast and still brings a lot of widespread snowfall, even though it's not a traditional coastal storm that we typically see. Across the southern half of the country, again, the western parts of the south look for the most part to average warmer than normal going forward here once we get past this current Arctic cold wave. And so as a jet stream shifts a little farther north in those areas, we should also see a generally drier trend as well. The south central U.S., for the most part, looking to average above normal for the next 3 months. But again, some additional Arctic cold possible for a time in February. Maybe we'll get another strong shot in March, but it won't be as predominant as areas farther north. So those warm periods may outweigh the cold ones in terms of the average. But certainly another risk to look forward to as we have a developing La Nina and we head into the spring season is the potential for an active severe weather pattern that gets going, especially by April across that area. And then across the southeast, again, for the most part, warmth is going to be favored overall. But again, those cold risks will still be present during April or during February and March for brief times, at least across those areas, but just not as persistent as the areas farther north. So looking farther north, though, across the Canadian areas, we do see, for the most part, a trend for western areas of Canada to average warmer than average for the remainder of the winter season, with some cold farther south and east. But if you look at the maps on the right, you can see a lot of that is going to be varying dramatically by months. We are looking to see those areas trend warmer for a time during February, although again, we could see cold return during the latter half of the month. But we are looking to see a cold March and April for portions of the central and the western parts of Canada. So definitely a lingering winter for many areas up there. And again, obviously, with that storm track potentially around the Canadian border, we could also see some heightened winter storm impacts for parts of southern Canada as well, from British Columbia eastward as we head into the early part of the spring season. We do again have a forecast for above average precipitation across British Columbia during February and southern areas there during March before things trend a little bit drier. But areas farther east again will be in that storm track, and so we could see the potential for some impactful winter storms. They may just kind of vary in where they go, and so may end up pretty close to average for many areas in terms of the overall precipitation totals across central Canada during the next few months, but definitely the potential for some impactful winter storms before we wind up the winter season. So looking globally here for the next several months, many areas are expected to trend warmer as we head through the balance of the winter season, but like here in North America, there's going to be a lot of volatility across Europe and Asia as well, likely to take place during the balance of the winter season, especially if we do see a major disruption to the polar vortex take place between now and the end of winter. But overall, the trend does favor more warmth as we head into the spring season than cold for other global areas. Now, on the renewable side, the pattern coming up here as we head into spring does look to be quite favorable for above average winds. Again, we have that potential as well heading into April for a heightened severe weather pattern across the central U.S. And so overall, potential for a lot of wind. So wind generation certainly likely to be higher than average for the upcoming months, and also more solar than average, likely for plains basically to the East Coast. So for the most part, renewables likely producing more power than average going forward here for the next few months. So kind of summarizing things here, for the most part, again, most guidance suggests we are going to see some additional periods of cold for the central and the eastern U.S., especially the northern half of those areas. Again, the best chances after we get past this initial cold wave would be sometime middle and late February, and again, potentially middle of March. So I have to watch those areas for impactful winter weather events to take place once again before we wrap up the winter season. Precipitation should be heavier in terms of the major storm impacts, mostly across the northern tier of the U.S. as we head through the balance of the winter season in early spring. Southern areas likely will see a ramp up in overall precipitation totals as we head into April. Again, severe weather, a big threat for the south central U.S. by that time. We could see some heavy rainfall along with that, possibly causing some flooding issues as well in some areas. The Northwest has the best area to see the heavier snowfall in terms of the mountain areas. California should trend drier relative to the early part of the winter, and so those areas will not be as snowy as they have been thus far. So looking at some industry impacts here. On the utility side, obviously, the big focus is what's coming up here for the next 2 weeks through the remainder of January. Some severe Arctic cold in many areas, and that's going to really produce a lot of high-level demand for heating in many areas, which will impact things. And plus, the ice across the south coming up here could potentially lead to widespread power outages in some areas of the southern tier of the U.S. as well. But again, we could see some additional rounds of severe cold coming in sometime during February, and then again, some additional rounds of cold in March. So we'll have to watch for those, especially if the polar vortex does get disturbed again during those time periods. But the central U.S., again, once we get past the next couple of weeks, likely won't be as persistently cold. But when the cold happens, it could still be quite strong, but just perhaps only for a week or two here and there, and not the long durations of cold. And again, the southern tier of the U.S. will have to watch for the severe weather risk as we head through the balance of the winter, with the heavier snow risk farther north. On the aviation side, the upcoming storm again is going to be a major impact for many of the airport hubs from DFW to Charlotte and Atlanta up to the Northeast corridor. So most of the New York City area, DC, all those areas are going to have quite a bit of impacts from the upcoming storm. Overall, though, once we get past that, we likely will see the northern tier of the U.S. having the most frequent storm impacts in those areas, and the generally stronger jet stream pattern across northern U.S. will also impact flight plans and so forth as well. The Southwest, though, for the most part, staying fairly dry, and so conditions should be pretty good in terms of airport impacts and travel for those areas. On the transportation side, again, trucking will be significantly impacted for much of the country going forward here the next 2 weeks with this major winter storm impacting a large area of the country. So the I-20, I-40 corridors that don't oftentimes see huge impacts, likely seeing them for multiple days with the storm. And again, much of the East Coast also under the gun coming up this weekend as well. Beyond that, again, the northern tier of the U.S. from the Dakotas, northwest to the Dakotas to the Great Lakes, all likely seeing a above average frequency of snow events going forward for the remainder of the winter. And so that will have a fairly persistent impact on transportation in those areas. Southern U.S. probably not quite as active going forward, but we could still see another winter storm sometime during February, so have to watch for that as well. And again, across the Northeast, a lot of variability going forward here in the upcoming weeks through February. So likely some additional impacts there as we wrap up the winter season. On the offshore side of things across the Gulf of Mexico, the overall pattern is going to potentially favor, after we get past this initial round of frontal passages through early February, we could see a reduced amount of them as we head through the spring season. And that could also lead to potentially some periods of above average sea fog episodes. And so we'll watch that as well for impacting places like Houston and Mobile Bay and causing delays in ships being able to get into port and so forth if we do see those more dense fog events develop during that time period. However, as we get into April, and especially as that overall pattern becomes more active across the South, the fog will become less of an issue, but we could see a lot more thunderstorm activity and things like that causing delays for shipping in the Gulf areas. Before we wrap up here, a quick glance at our upcoming summer forecast. This will obviously evolve a lot in the next couple of months, but with the developing El Nino, we'll have to see how that impacts things here and how fast it gets going. But for the most part, that may tend to temper the temperatures a little bit this summer season with above average forecasted temperatures for most areas, but not extreme heat for most of the central and eastern U.S. Typically, if we do see a strong El Nino get going, we tend to see conditions to be a little bit wetter for many areas as that strengthens during the summer season. So if we do see conditions become a little bit wetter, we could see the heat become a little bit less in terms of those 100-degree days and extreme heat days, but you would potentially see more humidity. So overall, a warm summer forecast for most areas, some potential for higher humidity instead of higher extreme actual temperatures for a lot of the central and eastern U.S., but for the most part, still looking to be a warmer than average summer, just not an extreme one, certainly for most areas of the eastern half of the country, the way it looks right now. And so with that, I'll pass things over here to Nate to see if we have had any questions come in that we can try to answer here.
Well, we don't have very many, so if anybody's listening out there, please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to ask questions if you have any during our closing minutes here till the top of the hour. We uh, do have all that time to answer, but yeah, one came in I thought would be interesting. With the idea that El Nino is coming, what do you think that says about the idea about the tropical season this year?
Well, certainly, if we look at historical El Nino years, those tend to be less active in the tropical season. Typically, those bring a lot more wind shear to the tropics as the flow pattern in those areas changes a lot from what we've seen during the last year or so with our La Nina. And so that would likely result in fewer storms than at least recent years. We may still end up near average or even a little bit above that long 30-year climatology baseline. But certainly we typically do not see the hyperactive number of storms that you see during a neutral or a La Nina year. So odds are it'll be a little bit quieter in terms of the overall storm numbers, But last year, for example, we just didn't really see anything of consequence impact the U.S., and so there's always a threat that you get one major Gulf storm that is a huge impact. So doesn't certainly mean we're not going to see a major impactful hurricane this next hurricane season, but current trends would suggest it's not going to be a hyperactive one at least.
Yeah, with El Nino coming on, yeah, that would make a lot of sense. Let's see how the details work out as we get closer. Thank you. Good information there, Steve. All right, looking at other questions. Um, let's see, lake effect. Let's talk a little bit about that. We've been off to a pretty good start this year. Um, do we expect that to continue? And I will, I'll answer that one. With a lot of that cold air that flowed over those relatively warm lakes so far this winter, lake effect snow, it's been kind of active. And certainly with this next cold shot coming up here towards the end of the month, and then the other ones coming later in the season, I would anticipate that there will be periods of more active lake effect. But the one thing to keep in mind is that we're going to be lowering water temperatures and increasing ice coverage with all this Arctic air coming up here. So places maybe downwind of Lake Erie may not see as much as they normally would. And I mean, a lot of Lake Erie freezes almost every winter, so we know that. But as far as other Great Lakes that typically don't freeze, yeah, I would anticipate there will be short bursts of maybe potentially significant lake effect snow that are still to come. Later in the season, especially get like into March, maybe there's less of it, but if we do get that cold shot during the middle to end part of February, I would anticipate a round of lake effect to come with that. But there'll also be some breaks when we get some of the milder periods going. Maybe late February into very early March, you start to see that shut off a bit. So lots of volatility involved, but lake effect season is hardly done yet, and I think we have a couple more large events to go. And yeah, one more question that came in. What is happening this summer to cause the elevated precipitation in the Northeast, coastal or Northeast coastal areas this summer?
So, in terms of those summer precipitation totals, there's obviously, again, a big influence on what happens with the developing El Nino. Um, we do obviously have still a warmer than average Atlantic Ocean, a warmer than average Gulf of Mexico. And so the result of that is that there's, as water is warmer than average, you tend to have higher evaporation rates. So any storms that do track in that area do tend to be wetter than they would otherwise be. So we have, an above average moisture supply and potentially an increase in the amount of this rain making systems that will come through as the summer progresses across the eastern US if we do get the El Nino to develop. So we'll have to watch that to see how that evolves going forward. Obviously, a big impact there is if we do see a tropical system move into the Northeast at some point this summer season too. You don't have to have a big hurricane, but if you just get a couple, say a tropical storm moves into the Gulf Coast and then heads up the Appalachians, you can get some real extreme rainfall events when you have all the water temperatures being as warm as they are like this and all that moisture supply readily available. So there's different ways we can get there this summer. Again, we have more moisture supply than usual, plus the El Nino potentially favoring a wetter regime developing this summer season. So we'll see how it all plays out. And that'll become a lot more certain once we head into the actual spring season, since the forecasts for Enzo are always a little bit subpar until we get into the spring, just because that transition period does tend to not be one that the models handle real well more times than not.
Well, that's very true. We are definitely entering that time of year where we have to be a little careful with some of the details. I think I'm gonna hand it back to Andrea. Now we are at the top of the hour. Close us down, please, Andrea.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Nathan, for a great presentation on what we can expect for the remainder of the season. I mentioned in the beginning of the session that we have recorded this webinar and we will be sending out the link to the recording and links to other resources available to you, including registering for the webinars, the Outlook webinars we have for the remainder of the year on our landing page. So you can get the recording, other resources, and able to register for our upcoming webinars when you get the email either later this week or early next week. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us and have a great day.